The sun had already begun its slow descent when I crested the last ridge of Dusk Hollow, the dry wind whipping dust into my eyes and cracking my lips. I had been riding for days without purpose the way I always did, taking whatever work came along the borderlands. Mend a barn roof for a meal and a night in the hay, patch a fence for a handful of coins in a corner of the stable, shoe a horse in exchange for bread and a place to lay my saddle. I never stayed longer than the job required. Villages wanted roots, and roots only ever led back to things I'd rather forget. My horse, an old gray gelding with a scarred flank, plodded on with the same tired rhythm he'd carried for years. The land around us was dying. Summer had turned the grass to brittle straw, the earth into a web of cracks wide enough to swallow a boot. Shallow wells were little more than mud holes now, and the wind carried the sharp, bitter smell of parched soil. People here looked up at the sky, more than they looked at each other, waiting for rain that no longer came. From the ridge I spotted the small farm tucked between two low hills. It sat alone, stubborn and half-broken. The cattle pen leaned hard to one side, the fence rails sagging like tired shoulders, the roof of the main house patched with whatever scraps the owner could find. A few thin cows grazed on the last stubble of grass, their ribs showing even from a distance. The place wasn't dead yet, but it was close enough that one strong wind or two more rainless weeks would finish it. I meant to ride past, I always did. A man on the road learns that stopping for every broken thing only breaks you faster. Then I saw her. She stood motionless in front of the wooden house, tall even for an orc woman, shoulders still squared, though exhaustion had hollowed her cheeks. Her skin was the deep green of border orcs, sun-baked and streaked with dust. Black hair was tied back in a hasty knot, strands clinging to the sweat on her neck. She wore a simple work shirt, sleeves rolled high, the fabric faded and torn at the elbows. Her hands, large, calloused, strong, were clenched so tight, the knuckles stood out pale. A large sheet of paper was nailed to the door behind her. The red seal at the bottom caught the last of the light. I didn't need to read it to know what it said. I had seen enough of those papers in my years on the road. I slowed the gelding to a walk. The mare's hooves made soft thuds on the hard-packed dirt. She turned her head at the sound golden eyes narrowing with the wariness of someone who had learned that strangers usually meant trouble. I stopped a respectful distance away, hands visible on the reins. "That notice real?" I asked. Her gaze flicked over me saddlebags, worn cloaked the dust on my boots before returning to my face. "You see it with your own eyes," she answered. Her voice was low rough from disuse but steady. "How many days?" "Left 14. "Starting today?" 14 days. The number sat heavy between us. I had heard it before. It was the kind of deadline lenders used when they wanted to pretend they were still being merciful while they tightened the noose. I studied the farm again. The main fence post nearest the road had rotted at the base. One good push, and half the pen would collapse. The water trough beside the barn had a long crack running down its side, leaking a thin trail of mud. The roof of the cattle shelter gaped open at one corner. It wasn't hopeless, but it was bleeding out slowly the way most things died out here, not with a scream, but with quiet, steady failure. She waited arms crossed now, watching me like she expected me to spur my horse and ride on. Most men would have. A lone orc woman on the edge of everything with a foreclosure notice on her door. Smart money said, "Keep riding." I looked at her again. Not at the exhaustion in her stance, but at the way she still stood straight, the way her jaw stayed set, even though her eyes told me she hadn't slept properly in days. She wasn't asking for help. She wasn't crying. She was simply refusing to fall over. I heard myself speak before I could think better of it. "If you give me one meal and a place to sleep tonight, I'll help you keep this place." The words hung in the dry air. Her golden eyes widened slightly, then narrowed again, searching my face for the joke or the trap. There was none. I wasn't even sure why I'd said it. I had no stake here. No debt to repay, no reason to stop. She stared at me a long moment. The wind tugged at loose strands of her hair and flapped the corner of the notice behind her. Finally, she spoke, voice flat. "My name is Mara Vare." I nodded once. "Kyle Rowan." She didn't invite me inside right away. Instead, she studied me like she was weighing whether I was worth the risk of another mouth to feed. I didn't blame her. Out here, trust was the first thing people ran out of. At last, she jerked her chin toward the sagging barn. "You can sleep in the empty stall. There's clean straw. I'll bring supper when it's ready." That was all. No thank you, no questions, just the barest acceptance. I swung down from the saddle boots, hitting the cracked earth. The gelding blew out a tired breath. As I led him toward the barn, I glanced back once. Mara Vere still stood in front of her door, staring at the notice like it might change if she glared hard enough. 14 days. I didn't know her story yet. I didn't know why an orc woman was fighting alone on land that looked ready to swallow her whole. But I knew the look in her eyes. I had worn it myself once a long time ago, before I learned that riding away was easier than staying. This time I didn't ride away. She didn't say much as she led me toward the barn. The structure leaned noticeably to the left, one support post cracked near the base. Inside, the air smelled of old hay dust and animal. She pointed to an empty stall at the far end. "You can sleep here. There's straw. Don't come into the house after dark." I nodded. Fair enough. She turned to leave, then paused. "I'll bring food when it's ready." I unsaddled my gelding, rubbed him down with a handful of dry grass, and gave him the last of the oats from my saddlebag. While I worked, I watched Mara walk back to the house. Her steps were heavy but deliberate. She moved like someone who had carried too much for too long. The main house was small but solid, built from rough-cut timber. Through the open door, I caught a glimpse of the interior before she closed it. One chair pulled out at the table, a single plate and cup drying on the shelf, farming tools stacked neatly in the corner because there was no one else to keep them in the shed. No second pair of boots by the door, no children's drawings or extra coats. Mara Vere lived here completely alone. True night had fallen by the time she returned carrying a wooden bowl. She handed it to me without a word. Inside was thin porridge made from old grain, a few dried roots, and 2 boiled eggs. It was the kind of meal that told its own story, someone stretching the last of their stores, yet still choosing to share the better portion with a stranger. I ate sitting on an upturned bucket outside the stall. She stood a few paces away, arms crossed, watching me like she was still deciding whether I was worth the risk. "Thank you," I said when the bowl was empty. "It's been a while since I had eggs." She shrugged. "They were the last 2. The silence stretched. The wind whispered through the cracks in the barn walls. I decided to push a little. That debt. Where did it come from? Mara stared at the ground for a long moment before answering. Her voice was low and flat, like she had told this story to herself too many times. "It was my father's farm. 3 years ago, he borrowed from the town treasury to expand the grazing land, buy better breeding stock, and dig a deeper well. Then the droughts came, 2 seasons in a row. The herd thinned fast. Father got sick in the last winter and never recovered. When he died, everything fell on me." She paused, jaw tight. The debt started at the treasury. Then it was sold to a private lender, Varrock Kryn. After that, the numbers started growing in ways that didn't make sense. I set the empty bowl down. "Can I see the papers?" She hesitated, then nodded once. "Come inside. But only to the table. Don't go further." The house was even smaller than it looked from outside. One main room with a hearth, a narrow bed against the far wall, and a sturdy table covered in ledgers. Mara brought out a thick stack of documents tied with frayed string. I sat and began reading by the light of a single lantern. It didn't take long to see the pattern. Interest rates changed without explanation, processing fees stacked on top of payments already made, clauses added in different ink, the kind of careful tampering that looked legal to someone desperate and exhausted. "This isn't just bad luck," I said quietly. "This is a trap." Mara's hands tightened on the edge of the table. "I know, but knowing doesn't fill the troughs or pay what he demands." I looked up at her. In the lantern light, her face looked even more worn, the shadows under her eyes deep. "If you lose the farm, where would you go?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm not afraid of wandering. I'm afraid of Varrock taking this land and saying my father died for nothing." That sentence hit harder than I expected. For Mara, this wasn't just dirt and wood and cattle. It was the last place that still carried her father's life. After we finished talking, I went back outside and walked the farm by moonlight. I noted what could be saved and what had to be sacrificed. The main fence needed urgent repair. The water cistern had a bad crack. The secondary well could still be cleared and deepened. There was still a chance if we moved fast and smart. Later, as I prepared to settle into the straw, Mara appeared at the barn door again, a faint silhouette against the stars. "You really doing all this for one meal and a night's sleep?" she asked. I looked at her standing there, tired but unbowed, and answered honestly, "No, because I've watched too many places die simply because no one stopped long enough to help." She didn't reply immediately. The wind moved through the dry grass between us. Finally, she spoke. "Tomorrow, I'll show you the deep well my father started digging. It wasn't much, but for Mara Vere that was as close to trust as she could offer right now." I nodded. "I'll be ready before first light." She turned and walked back toward the house, leaving me alone with the quiet creak of the barn and the heavy knowledge that 14 days wasn't nearly enough time. But for the first time in years, I wasn't planning to ride away at dawn. The next morning I woke before the first gray light touched the horizon. The barn was still dark, the straw rustling under me as I sat up. I had slept better than I expected. I stepped outside and saw Mara already at work. She was pulling water from the well shoulders bare and glistening with early sweat despite the cool air. The bucket rose steadily heavy with what little the ground still gave. She didn't look surprised when I walked over. She simply nodded toward the barn. "Rope and tools are inside. We start with the fence." We worked without wasting words. I drove new posts where the old ones had rotted through. Mara hauled rails, her arms corded with muscle earned from years of doing 3 people's labor alone. The sun climbed higher, turning the dry earth into a furnace. By mid-morning, sweat stung my eyes and my shirt clung to my back. Mara never slowed. She knew every weak spot in the fence the way other people know the lines on their own palms. At one point, she straightened, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist. "You keep telling me to cut things away," she said. "Like it's simple." "It isn't simple," I answered, hammering another nail. "But trying to save everything at once is how you lose everything. We fix what keeps the cattle alive first. The rest comes later if it comes." She stared at the far fields where the grass had already turned to dust. For a long moment, I thought she would argue. Then she gave a single sharp nod. Fine. We let the south pasture go. It was the first real concession she made, not because she trusted me completely, but because she was tired of watching pieces of her father's dream die one by one while she tried to hold them all. By afternoon, we had the main fence standing straight again. The cattle lowed at the new grass we had managed to lead them to. Mara stood beside me, breathing hard, and for the first time, I saw something besides exhaustion in her face, pride thin and stubborn, but real. Later, while we cleared the clogged irrigation ditch, she asked without looking up, "You ever run a farm before Cale?" The sound of my name in her mouth caught me off guard. It was the first time she had used it. "Not mine," I said. "My father's. Until a man like Varrock took it." She paused, the shovel resting on her shoulder. "Same story, close enough. He borrowed to buy better seed. Drought came. The lender changed the numbers. One morning, the sheriff nailed a notice to our door. I was 16. I left the same day and never looked back." Mara studied me for a long beat. The wind moved through the dry stalks around us. "I thought about leaving too," she said quietly, "after my father died. But this land still smells like him when it rains, even when it doesn't rain. That was all she gave me, but it was enough." We kept working. On the 4th day, we rode into town together. The streets were dusty and half empty. Mara kept her shoulders back and her eyes forward, ignoring the stares that followed an orc woman and a stranger riding side by side. We found the old ledger keeper who had once worked at the treasury. He spoke in a low voice behind a stack of crates, afraid of being overheard. "Varrock bought your father's debt cheap," he told Mara. "Then he rewrote the terms. The interest he's charging you isn't what the original contract says. He's done it to others too." He wouldn't testify in the open, but he scratched a name on a scrap of paper and slid it across the table. "Fan Quan Helrick. He hates men like Varrock. If anyone can read the fine print and make it stick, it's him." We left town with the name and the uneasy knowledge that paper could be more dangerous than any blade. On the long ride back, Mara rode in silence for a while. Then she spoke, voice low enough that the wind almost carried it away. "Kyle, just my name again. But this time, it sounded different, less like a test and more like an anchor. That night, she didn't eat standing at the stove. She sat across from me at the table with her own bowl of thicker soup. We didn't talk much, but the silence had changed. It was no longer two strangers measuring each other. It was two people carrying the same weight and beginning to believe the other wouldn't let go. We counted the days before we turned in. 10 left. The fence stood straighter. The cattle had better grass. The deep well Mara's father had started was clearing slowly. But the real danger still waited in Varrock's ledgers, and we both knew it. Mara sat on the doorstep looking out over the dry fields. The lantern light from inside touched the side of her face. "If we lose," she said, "at least this time I'm not losing alone." I didn't answer right away. The words settled in my chest like something warm and dangerous. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about the next road or the next job. I was thinking about tomorrow on this land, beside this woman who refused to fall. 10 days. We still had 10 days. The 5th morning came with a hard frost that crunched under our boots. We left the farm before the sun cleared the ridge and rode the long road into town. Mara sat stiff in the saddle, one hand resting on the hilt of the old knife she kept at her belt. She had not spoken much since we left, but I could feel the tension rolling off her like heat from dry ground. Fan Quan Helric kept his office in a narrow stone building behind the market square. He was older than I expected, gray hair, cropped short eyes, sharp as broken glass. He did not offer us chairs. He simply took the stack of papers Mara handed him and began reading in silence. Minutes stretched. The only sound was the scratch of his pen as he made notes in the margin. Finally, he looked up. "Your father's original contract is here?" he said, tapping one sheet. "Varrock bought it cheap, then rewrote half the terms. Interest rates that change without notice. Phantom fees stacked on top of payments already made. This is not lending. This is theft, dressed in ink." Mara's shoulders loosened a fraction, but her jaw stayed tight. "Can you stop him?" Helric leaned back. "I can slow him. But to kill the debt, I need him to admit it or catch him with the real ledgers. One way is to make him think you're ready to break. Let him believe you're coming to negotiate surrender. Men like Varrock get careless when they smell victory. I hated the plan the moment he said it. It put Mara in the middle of the trap. But when I opened my mouth to argue, she spoke first. I'll do it." Her voice was quiet, but there was iron under it. She looked at me, not Helric. "This land is mine. I won't hide behind you while we fight for it." I closed my mouth. There was nothing left to say. We arranged the meeting for the next afternoon in Varrock's office above the grain warehouse. Mara went in alone first as planned. I waited in the narrow alley with Helric and 2 quiet guards he trusted. The air smelled of dust and old barley. Through the half-open window, we heard everything. Varrock's voice was smooth and oily. "Wise decision, Mara. A woman, especially an orc woman, shouldn't have to carry this burden. Sign the transfer and I'll let you keep the little house." "Generous, yes," Mara's reply was steady. "Show me the books again. I want to see the final number before I sign." Papers rustled. Varrock chuckled. Still clinging to hope, your father was a fool who borrowed more than he could repay. If he had been smarter, I wouldn't have had to squeeze the life out of his little farm. But you? You held on longer than most. Almost admirable. I saw Helric's jaw clench beside me. That was the slip we needed, arrogance loosening Varrock's tongue. Mara kept him talking. "The interest you added last month, it doesn't match the original contract." Varrock laughed outright. "Contracts are flexible when the borrower is desperate. Now sign or I'll have my men remove you today." That was the signal. Helric stepped through the door with the 2 guards behind him. I followed. Varrock's face went from triumph to shock in a heartbeat. His hand shot toward a side drawer, but one of the guards was faster. Varrock slammed the ledger shut and hurled it into the small iron stove burning in the corner. Flames licked up the pages before we could reach it. "Too late," he snarled. "The original is already gone." Helric's voice was cold. "Not all of it. We have enough to freeze the seizure for now. You're finished, Kren." But Varrock only smiled thin and ugly. "Freeze it then. I still have 10 days on the public notice, and I don't need paper to take what I want." We left with partial proof and a warning that Varrock would not wait to be caught. The next 4 days passed in a blur of hard work and shorter nights. We sold 2 of the stronger cows at market price, patched the last weak section of roof, and deepened the secondary well until clear water finally rose. The farm looked almost alive again, but every evening Mara and I counted the remaining days on our fingers. On the 10th day, the trouble arrived. I was in the cattle pen when I heard the horses. 3 riders came over the ridge Varrock in front, flanked by 2 thick-shouldered men who looked like they broke bones for coin. They rode straight into the yard and stopped hard enough to scatter dust over the new fence rails. Varrock swung down, holding a fresh copy of the foreclosure notice like a weapon. "Time's almost up, Mara. Sign now and keep the house, or my men will drag you off this land today." Mara stepped out of the barn, pitchfork still in her hands. She did not run. She walked to my side and stood shoulder to shoulder with me. No words passed between us. None were needed. I moved first. Varrock's men came at us fast. The first swung a heavy club. I caught the shaft with the long-handled shovel I had been using twisted hard and drove the handle into his gut. He folded. The second man tried to circle behind me. Mara was already there. She swung the pitchfork like a staff, catching him across the knees. He went down, cursing. Varrock pulled a short blade and lunged at Mara. I stepped between them. The knife sliced across my forearm, hot and sharp, but I grabbed his wrist and slammed him against the water trough. Wood cracked. He gasped, eyes wide with sudden fear. "You thought no one would stand with her," I said, voice low. Blood ran down my arm and dripped onto the dry earth. "You were wrong." Helric and the town guards arrived minutes later, drawn by the noise and the message we had sent ahead. They found Varrock on his knees, the 2 hired men groaning on the ground, and the partial ledger pages we had managed to save from the stove fire. One of the guards pulled a second set of hidden records from Varrock's saddlebag, exact copies of the real debts, the ones he had burned in panic. Helric read them aloud in a flat voice. "Fraud. Forgery. Extortion. You're done, Kren." Varrock said nothing as the iron cuffs closed around his wrists. He only stared at Mara with pure hatred while they led him away. The yard fell quiet again. Dust settled. My arm burned where the knife had cut, but I barely felt it. Mara stood beside me, breathing hard, pitchfork still gripped tight. Blood flecked her sleeve, not hers. She looked at the empty road where Varrock had disappeared, then turned to me. For the first time since I had ridden up to her door, the exhaustion in her eyes was mixed with something brighter. We had bought more than time. We had bought the chance to fight the real battle, the one that would decide whether this land lived or died. And for the first time, neither of us had to fight it alone. The dust had barely settled in the yard when Helric finished reading the last of Varrock's hidden records aloud. The iron cuffs clicked shut around the lender's wrists, right there between the water trough and the newly mended fence. Varrock said nothing as the guards led him away, but his eyes burned with the kind of hate that promised he would remember this day for the rest of his life. I didn't care. He was finished. Helric turned to Mara, wiping sweat and ink from his hands. "The debt is void. Every forged clause, every illegal fee gone. The farm is yours again, free and clear. No more 14-day clock." Mara stood motionless for a long moment, pitchfork still gripped in her hands, blood from a shallow cut on her forearm mixing with the dust on her skin. Then she exhaled a sound that was half laugh, half sob, the sound of someone who had been holding her breath for 3 years. The farm was hers, but victory didn't paint the grass green or fill the wells with sweet water. The land was still dry and cracked, the cattle were still thin. The roof still needed more patches before the next storm. We had only won the right to keep fighting. That night, we sat on the front steps like we had done so many times in the last 10 days. The lantern inside the house cast a warm square of light across the dirt. Mara's shoulder brushed mine. Neither of us moved away. "I kept this place for my father," she said quietly, staring at the dark fields. Every day I told myself I couldn't let it die because it would mean he died for nothing. But tonight I realized I want it for me too. I want to wake up here. I want to see rain on these hills again. I want to build something that's mine. I turned to look at her. The lantern light caught the sharp line of her jaw and the faint scar along her collarbone I had never noticed before. She was beautiful, in the way strong things are beautiful, worn, stubborn, alive. I thought I was only stopping for one meal, and one night I told her. My voice came out rough. But somewhere between fixing that fence and watching you swing a pitchfork at Varrock's man, I stopped thinking about the next road. I don't want to ride away anymore, Mara. She was quiet for a long time. Then she stood, walked into the house, and came back with two things: the heavy ring of keys that opened every lock on the farm and the worn leather ledger that listed every cow, every tool, every acre still left to us. She placed them both in my hands. If you stay, she said, you stay as more than a hired hand. You stay as part of this, the good days and the dry ones, the work and the quiet nights. All of it. I closed my fingers around the keys. The metal was still warm from her palm. I'm staying, I said. No grand promises, no flowery words. Just the truth between two people who had learned how heavy a promise could be. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were ours. We sold 3 more cows at a fair price and used the coin to buy seed that could survive the drought. I finished the roof while Mara cleared the irrigation ditches again. We traded labor with the nearest orc family for fresh hay. Slowly the farm began to breathe again. Evenings became something new. Mara laughed more short, startled laughs, like she had forgotten she still knew how. I stopped sleeping in the barn and moved my blanket roll into the small room off the kitchen. Some nights we talked until the lantern burned low. Some nights we sat in silence and listened to the wind move through the dry grass, knowing it could not take the land from us anymore. One morning I woke to find Mara already outside, kneeling in the dirt beside the deep well her father had started. She had planted a row of hardy, drought-resistant beans along the edge. When she saw me, she wiped her hands on her trousers and stood. I'm not fighting for a memory anymore, she said. I'm fighting for tomorrow. I stepped close enough that our shadows touched. Then we'll fight for it together. She looked up at me, golden eyes steady, no longer guarded, and for the first time since I had ridden up to her door, she smiled without any weight behind it. The farm was still rough around the edges. The debt was gone, but the work would never be. Yet standing there with Mara Vere keys in my hand and her shoulder against mine, I understood something I had never let myself believe on all those long roads. Some places are worth stopping for. Some people are worth staying for. And sometimes, a single stranger riding past says a few simple words one meal and one night and ends up finding the place he was always meant to call home.